Okay, time for section 3.2. Now, a lot of the things in this section you will already know, but we will be ramping it up a little by adding some new biology words. Alright, the first thing we're going to talk about is organisms that make their own energy. So any organism that can make glucose or make its own food is called an autotroph. Now the word autotroph is a new word for us, and the same word you may have heard before is known as primary producer. So a primary producer is also known as an autotroph. Now these autotrophs begin with the sun. So most of them begin with photosynthesis, and here is the equation for photosynthesis showing that carbon dioxide and water and coming together using sunlight and an important pigment called chlorophyll, which we'll be learning a lot about later this year, produces glucose and oxygen. Here's that important macromolecule, glucose. Photosynthesis is a chemical reaction where we take water and carbon dioxide to store the sun's energy in glucose. The energy is stored in the bonds within the glucose molecule, and then in plants, glucose, remember, is stored as the polysaccharide starch. So carbon dioxide and water with the sun's light energy producing various kinds of carbohydrates and oxygen. When we think about producers, most of the time trees and grasses and other plants come to mind. And on land, they are the main photosynthetic producers. But in freshwater ecosystems, we think about algae, and also we think about some bacteria that can do photosynthesis, and the bacteria that can do photosynthesis are known as cyanobacteria. These cyanobacteria can actually grow so prolifically that you can actually see them from aerial photographs. And here's an example of a what we call a tidal bloom, where we see all these bacteria. And so these are very important in water ecosystems. Now, in deep sea ecosystems, such as this undersea ocean vent, the ocean is so deep that there is no possible way that light can penetrate that far, so photosynthesis is not a good way for producers to come up with their energy. So instead, they were able to take inorganic molecules. Remember, inorganic means without carbon. And they can take these chemicals that do, like hydrogen sulfide, that do not contain carbon, and actually produce carbohydrates, like glucose. So instead of photosynthesis, photo meaning light, we call it chemosynthesis, chemicals synthesizing to make the carbohydrate food. Producers use most of the energy they make for themselves. They produce it, they store it temporarily, and then they're going to use it. The way that they use the energy that they store is what we call cellular respiration. Producers use it to supply the energy they need to live. So do you. And this is the chemical reaction that releases the energy stored in glucose. So if you analyze the chemical equation just for a minute, we would remember that oxygen was a byproduct of photosynthesis. Now oxygen is a reactant. Oxygen, and here's that all-important macromolecule glucose, and oxygen and glucose produce water and carbon dioxide plus a ton of energy. So here's the energy that was from the sun that we stored temporarily, and now we're going to use it in the producers, or we can do it also in our bodies. Now, not all of the energy that producers have is used by them. So some of the energy can be passed along to other organisms that cannot make their own energy, like you and me. Organisms that cannot make their own energy are called heterotrophs. Now, you probably have heard a word similar to heterotroph, and that would be called a consumer. So heterotroph, new word, means the same thing as consumers. It just means any organism that cannot make its own energy and must consume something else. Consumers that eat producers to get energy are called primary consumers. They can also be called first order consumers. So you may have called them previously herbivores. Those are plant eaters. So anything that is a herbivore that eats a producer to get its energy is called a primary consumer. Most of the energy that the primary consumer gets is used. So just like with the producers, most of the energy that they have is used and only some of it is passed on. Works the same with consumers. Most of the energy a primary consumer gets from the producers is consumed or used up. Some of the energy moves to the atmosphere as heat, some of it is lost as heat, and some of it is stored. So some energy is stored and not lost to the atmosphere or used, and this energy is available for another consumer to use. Sometimes we'll call them predators. So this is a next level of consuming. A consumer that eats another consumer for energy is called a secondary or second order consumer. A good example would that be a lion. A lion is a second order consumer because a lion ate a gazelle. A gazelle ate a grass. So gazelles are first order consumers, lions are second order consumers. Just as with all of the other levels we've been talking about, most of the energy that the secondary consumer gets is used. Some of the energy that a secondary consumer takes in is lost as heat, but again, some can be stored and passed on to another consumer, just as with the previous levels we talked about. A consumer that eats a consumer that already ate a consumer, so this would be like the third level of consuming, is called a third order or tertiary consumer. So this would be a third level of heterotroph. Now we're going to talk about different types of consumers. Most of these words you probably already heard before. First, we'll talk about herbivores. These are our first order heterotrophs. They eat only plants. Cows, caterpillars, deer are good examples. Now, omnivores and carnivores are examples of other kinds of consumers. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. We are a good example of an omnivore, bears and pigs as well. Carnivores, of course, eat only animals, lions, snakes, and dogs. Now, both omnivores and carnivores could be either second order or third order heterotrophs, depending on what they were consuming. Omnivores also could be first order because if they eat plants. Now, the next category we'll talk about here is the scavenger. These eat carcasses of other consumers. So, examples, vultures, blowflies, raccoons, hyenas. And when we say carcasses, as we're talking about recently dead organisms. The last two types of consumers that we'll talk about are consumers that work to take dead organisms and break them down and return their nutrients to the soil. Once the nutrients are returned to the soil and to the air, they can be reused by other organisms. Decomposers feed by actually chemically breaking down dead matter. Bacteria and fungi or mushrooms break down and begin the decomposing process. The detritivores eat fragments of dead matter and also break them down, and these would be examples would be earthworms and millipedes. So both decomposers and detritivores work to break down dead and decaying material in the ecosystem.